Croeso, Difda, Bernachtin, Gia Hwitch, Fulcher, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. I am your humble host, Sian Esther Powell, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. That's Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Isle of Man, Scotland and Ireland. Welcome. Hello, good everyone. Hello, let's try that again. I think that went better. Hello, good evening. A little bit of a drama lately. I thought I had broken my computer, or my ancient relic of a computer had, gone kaput. But actually there was just a cable that wasn't, completely plugged in. So crisis averted. And I thought I better do a podcast episode whilst I still can. I think this is just a really great example about how technical I am. So for those of you who don't know, I'm also on TikTok, and I recently set up a TikTok for my museum that I work at, Wheel Martin Museum. So if you want to see me running around 26 acres of an old Victorian clayworks, turning on historic pump engines and water wheels, then please do so. But I give off the impression to lots of people that I'm very technical by doing things like this, when actually I've got no clue. No clue whatsoever about anything. I am winging it through life. I am hanging on by a thread and winging it through life. And you know what? 28 years, 29 in a few months. Is it a few months? 6 months? Okay, I'm 28 and a half. Okay, because I'm obviously a child and I count my age by halves now. 28 and a half, and I've managed to get through life thus far, winging it. So there we go. Hello, everyone. Really feel sorry for anyone that has never listened to my podcast before, who jumps in at the latest episode, because they probably turn off before 30 seconds are done. They're like, who is this mad woman? Why am I not getting the Celtic myths now? Inject those Celtic myths into my veins. Why is she blabbering on? But any of you who have been listening to me for a long time seem to tolerate the waffle, and so the waffle will continue, I'm afraid. Hello, those of you who have listened to me before know that every single episode we focus on one of these 6 Celtic nations. Now, the Celtic nations are labelled as such because they have an existing Celtic language. That seems to be the kind of general official consensus for why they are Celtic nations. So we are back to lovely Brittany, which I'm very, very excited for. Now, I don't have preferences, even though I'm Cornish and Welsh. Obviously, I love doing the Cornish and Welsh episodes, but I love doing the Irish and the Scottish and the Manx episodes as well. But I do have a fondness for the Breton episodes, because apparently Breton and Cornish are probably the most similar in terms of language and in terms of culture, and probably in terms of landscape as well. I would love to visit Brittany, and if there are any Breton listeners or French listeners I cannot speak today. If there's any French listeners or Breton listeners, please let me know. It would be just so lovely to think that there are actual people over there listening to this show as well. I would love to visit your beautiful nation one day, and hopefully I will. I'm going to be talking about lots of lovely things like death today, death portents in Breton mythology. I am sure that I've done this episode before. I think I've talked about this previously, but I once did a bonus episode when I had more mental energy and my mental health was a little bit better, and my physical health was probably a little bit better as well. I was actually recording a fair bit of mini episodes for people. I deeply apologise that I have not been able to do that recently, and I hope that I can get back to doing it one day, or even just doing TikToks or kind of 1, 2, 3 minute videos for people instead. I really hope that I can get back to doing that one day. It is my kind of deepest wish to find a better balance between my storytelling content and, my actual job that I do enjoy and I do love, but that does, pay my bills. I'm getting a little bit more storytelling sort of freelance type of work. So who knows, in the future, I might strike a finer balance between the two. I would love, and I've said this for many years, I would love to be able to focus more on this podcast. If I'm talking about a dream world here, my dream world scenario would be that this is kind of my full focus, really, that storytelling and myths and legends and folklore and the research around it and the sharing of those stories could be my main focus. Maybe one day that would be my dream. I'm waffling again, and we are, past minute 5 now. So welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about death today. We're going to be talking about lots of creepy things. And before we do, I thought I'd fill you in on a little bit about my life. Some of you hate that, so just skip forward a little bit, okay? If you don't want to hear any of this, skip forward a bit until I start talking about spookies. And we're getting to Halloween. Oh my God, if I can get this out before Halloween, I will be so chuffed with myself, because this is a real Halloweeny type episode, even though I'm not talking about Samhain. I probably should have done that around Halloween if I could plan better, but I can't because my brain doesn't really work very well. Oh, I'm also having surgery soon. So I'm having surgery in a couple of weeks. So tomorrow I'm having my pre-surgery appointment to kind of weigh me, and they can tell me that I'm overweight and, all these other things that I know. But as long as they can, as long as I'm well for them to kind of, operate on both eyes at once, because that's what they're going to do, which is going to be really fun for me. So I'm having surgery soon. Work is going well. I love my job. Like I said, check out the TikTok account. You'll see all about it. You'll see all of my little shenanigans. And also I've joined a shanty singing group. So that's going very well. Singing my shanties. And you know what I discovered, guys? I've actually got quite a good voice. When I say good, I think good for shanties because it's very loud and obnoxious and sounds, it bellows well in pubs. But that's all I dreamt of anyway, being not a pub singer as in like, a pub singer as in an actual pub shout singer. So those of you not aware, a pub shout is kind of like quite a Cornish thing, but obviously you find it in loads of other places as well. A lot of Celtic nations seem to like a pub shout, where you just kind of sit in a pub and start singing songs, and then people join you. They join you or they don't, but hopefully they do, and you sing kind of folk songs, shanties, traditional songs, working songs, all sorts of stuff that other people might know and might join you in on. But it's good fun, and I absolutely love it. So that is all my life stuff out of the way. How are you all? You can reply to me right now. I might not be hearing you, but I'll take it in. I can sense the I'm not clairvoyant in any way whatsoever. Although one of my great uncles, I don't know if I've ever told you this, one of my great something uncles, Evan John Powell, or John Evan Powell, I can't remember which way it is. He was a good friend to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, probably in a bit of an exploitative way, actually, I'm going to be honest to you. He was a Merthyr-born man, but he lived in Paynton, and he was a clairvoyant, and apparently he was quite a well-known clairvoyant at the time. And of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got into that sort of stuff when his son died. So yeah, that is my tiny little claim to fame there, but I don't think any of the clairvoyant medium blood runs in my veins, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, I'm too much of a wimp for that kind of stuff, and it's too much of a responsibility, really. But there we go. We are now on, what are we, almost 9 minutes into the podcast, and we haven't talked about what we're going to talk about once, the Ankou. There you go. Look at me just slipping it in there. The Ankou, the Breton Ankou. I don't know if any of you are really into goth music, so it probably will come as no surprise for you to find out that I was a teenage goth, and I still am at heart. Very much not a teenager anymore, as I made, pretty clear at the start of the episode. Almost 29 years old. Wow, ancient. What an ancient hag I am. That's a joke. I do quite look forward to being an ancient hag one day. I think I could rock that. I think I could really vibe with that. Anyway, if you've ever really listened to Fields of Nephilim, the goth band Fields of Nephilim, they pretty much all dress up like the Breton Ankou. I don't know if that is intentional, but it just kind of cracks me up. That's how I imagine the Breton Ankou to look like, roaming around the beautiful, picturesque countryside of Brittany in, big hats and farming kind of wear. Anyway, let's talk about him because he's pretty cool. Now, apparently there are also a Welsh and Cornish version of the Ankou, although I've never come across it in either the mythology of Cornwall or Wales, but it'd be really, really cool if anyone else has and we can compare. But the Breton Ankou seems to be a kind of a version of the Grim Reaper in an interesting way, but not as simplistic as that, so don't quote me on that. It is both a servant of death and a sort of personification and anthropomorphization. That's a big word, isn't it? And I don't think I said it right, of death. So as I mentioned before, kind of dressed similar to the Fields of Nephilim crew in that it is often a kind of tall, slim figure, masculine figure usually, in a large brimmed hat and sometimes a black robe, but sometimes kind of a jacket and kind of maybe peasant farming gear in a way. Sometimes seen as a shadow or, you know, it's sort of like a silhouette of something, and sometimes seen as a skeleton. But pretty creepy in whatever kind of version you're seeing him in. Now, he also, why I said Grim Reaper is that the Ankou. The Ankou also wields a scythe, which, yes, some of you will know is, you know, a farming tool, and sits atop a cart. I'm going to assume it's a cart that's sort of bursting at the seams with straw and beautiful, lovely animals. Oh no, sorry, it's a cart for the dead. The Ankou is collecting the dead. And sometimes, in a similar fashion to sort of the Irish Doulahan that I talked about recently, sometimes the Ankou has a cart that's drawn, not a car, a carriage, a very spooky looking Gothic carriage that is drawn by very spooky big black horses. I really like to imagine all of the creatures from like Celtic mythology kind of comparing notes and trying to outspook each other and giving each other like fashion sense and just general ideas. I just think that would be really, really fun. Like you've got the Ankou and the Doulahan just chatting in a casual way, you know, as friends. Like, dude, I think you could get away with that being a longer black robe. Oh, well, you know what? I think that you should have a cart. Do you know what? You've got a carriage. Why can't I have a carriage? So on, so forth. I don't know how they form the bonds of friendship, these creatures. I'm just theorising here. I'm just guessing. This is guesswork. But all in all, the Ankou is a pretty scary figure. Like all folklore, the Ankou has many differing origins. There is the version of the story, which is probably the most common that I've come across in books, that the Ankou is the first person to die in the year. Although, like I said, it's always a masculine figure, so a lot of men dying. Sorry about that, fellas. But it's supposed to be the first person to die in the year, and that means that it is the Ankou's job to harvest the souls of the dead for the rest of the year before he himself can go to the afterlife. So the Ankou is almost like a character, like the Dread Pirate Roberts, okay? It's like not one person, but many people playing a character and adopting the title of Ankou. But of course, lots of people don't like any folklore stories associated with the peasantry or peasants in general. So of course, there's another version of the myth that's tied to princes and more regal, important people. You didn't see, but I did quotation marks over important, but there we go. Because one version of the Ankou myth is that the Ankou was a cruel prince who met death during a hunting trip. And of course, this is an arrogant prince. Of course, he's not a nice chap. Nice chaps don't get turned into skeletal, horrifying personifications of death. No, this was a horrible, arrogant prince who thought that he could challenge death itself. And he said, right, death, look at that black stag over there. I bet that I can kill that black stag before you can. I'm sorry, dude. A black stag. Are you a black stag? That seems pretty spooky to me. Are you really telling me that you think that you can chase down a black stag, which is basically looks like death's pet, You can get that before death. Really? Whatever. Anyway, the prince says, Death, I can kill this black stag before you, and we'll go on a hunting trip and I'll prove it to you. And of course, he doesn't win. Death's like, oh, piece of cake. Death won the contest and cursed the prince to roam the earth as the creepy skeletal Ankou forever. And in some versions, the Ankou is also depicted as some kind of king of the dead, in the same way that Hades is, portrayed as the king of the underworld in Greek mythology. The Ankou is portrayed as a deity. I'm going to be honest with you and say that my favourite version of the Ankou myth is simply the first person to die in the year, and then they collect the rest of the souls up for the remaining year, and then go on to the afterlife, and then the next person, and then the next person, and then the next person kind of takes on that role. That is my favourite version of the myth. You might have a different favourite version, and that's absolutely fine. It's quite cool to think about an arrogant prince challenging death itself to a majestic hunt in the misty forest. Like, that's a pretty cool mental image. But there's something about the kind of the farming imagery and the peasantry imagery to me about the Ankou just seeming to be like the soul of a normal kind of working man in the village or the parish. Does Brittany have parishes? Anyway, if you're from Breton, tell me what's the equivalent of a parish in Brittany. But I like to think that the Ankou is just the first person to die in a year, and they kind of take on this sacred, important responsibility of taking the souls of everyone else that's going to die in the year, and then they can go to rest. Because it's not necessarily evil or overly dramatic. It simply is. This is a job. This is a responsibility. And it's not sinister in a way. Don't get me wrong. I love a bit of sinister mythology and folklore. But it doesn't seem to have as sinister connotations when it's simply performing a duty, performing a role. It kind of gives it a more somber kind of responsible vibe, if you will, because the Ankou is also said to very much patrol churchyards and graveyards and kind of just hang around graveyards, collecting up the souls of the dead and kind of caretaking the churchyard as well. So the Ankou really is a worker. It's a person, and I like to think, a worker performing a role. This is not like landed gentry. This is not some prince. This is a working man, working soul performing a duty and then hoping to be rewarded at the end of it by being set free. The Ankou are very much connected to churches in this way. So you can find really interesting church architecture and sculptures within churches in Brittany. And I think maybe in other parts of the world, like I said, in Cornwall and Wales, we're said to have a version of the Ankou as well, where you see this kind of this figure that could very well be the Ankou, this watcher, this caretaker of the dead, usually portrayed as a skeleton in these kind of instances. And it's actually as a church guardian in these bits of architecture that we get a lot of our aesthetic depictions of the Ankou. So, as I said, the Ankou often holds a scythe, but has also been known to hold other forms of weaponry as well. Lances, spears, arrows, there's other forms of weaponry seen in these churchyard depictions of the Ankou, very much shown as a skeletal figure in these versions. But there are other depictions of the Ankou, like I said, wearing a wide-brimmed hat with white flowing hair, black robes, or kind of dark clothing, raggedy clothing in general, sometimes with kind of black abyss where the eyes should be, and other times described as glowing embers in the sockets, fire, burning in the eye sockets. Certainly a very creepy figure to come across in the dead of the night, riding on his dark cart or his black hearse. Many different depictions, but all very funeral and funerary in nature. Now, as mentioned before, the Ankou is kind of my favourite depiction of him as one being very working, like a peasantry almost. So he's seen as the henchman of death, riding atop his cart, but he also has two kind of workers or other henchmen that work alongside him, that walk alongside the cart. And they're usually found on these lonely countryside roads. Now, very often corpse roads, really, lichways or corpse roads. Now, these were historic routes that were used to transport the dead. So when churches were further and further afield in deeply rural areas, you would have these roads, these corpse roads, which would be used to transport the dead. So of course, these corpse roads have lots of folklore and mythology associated with them as well. Find many stories of ghosts, spirits, wraiths, and other ghouls and ghostly things associated with these corpse roads or procession roads. So the Ankou, in his black hearse or carriage or cart, drawn by black horses or black oxen, very much kind of, like I said, farm imagery. This Ankou gives off the impression of a funerary procession. Don't know why I'm giggling there, because it's pretty creepy, really. So if you do come across this fellow in the dead of the night, make sure that he doesn't attack you with his scythe or his arrow or his spear or his lance, because the touch of that weapon means that your soul's going to be yanked, just yeeted right out of your body. But if you've ever wondered what one of those kind of gates with a big roof over the top in front of churches is, they're lich gates. So that would have been the entrance that you would have taken the corpses out or through. So once they've made their treacherous journey along these corpse roads, they would be taken into the church or from the church through these lich gates. So I only found that out quite recently, to be honest. I thought I'd slip that bit of knowledge in there. But there's loads of really old, beautiful churches around my area of Cornwall and Cornwall in general. And I'd really love to explore them a bit more. And I've always wondered what those gates with the big roofs are, because they look really important and significant, and now I know that those are the lich gates. So you can imagine the Ankou travelling along these darkened, very rural roads, these procession roads, these corpse roads or lich roads, and then kind of ending up in the church, entering in through the lich gate, and then taking up his watchful role as the guardian of the churchyard. Now, in his The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, Walter Evan Wentz, and I think I've quoted him before, but he says, the Ankou, who is a king of the dead, and his subjects, like a fairy king and fairies, have their own particular paths or roads over which they travel in great sacred processions. And exactly as fairies, the hosts of the dead are in possession of the earth on November Eve. I did tell you that this would be a very good Halloween episode. So someone out there, if you want to do an absolutely killer ensemble Halloween costume one day, why don't you make up a massive black coach, carriage or hearse? You can dress up with a white flowing wig, a wide brimmed hat, black robes, get a couple of your mates to be the henchmen of death, and maybe have a few spirits and wraiths in the background, kind of, heaping on corpses, or, pretending to work, throwing the dead souls onto your cart. That would be pretty cool. But make sure that you also do it in the dead of the night on very dark rural roads. No, actually, don't do that. That's very unsafe. Please, no one do that. Don't go on dark rural roads dressed up like death portents. It's probably not a very good idea if there are any such things lurking around themselves. So as mentioned before, the Ankou wasn't really a singular figure, but was instead a role, a job, adopted by the first person to die in the year, or the last person to die in the year that kind of takes on the role for the following year. So that means that there's lots of Ankous from different regions of Brittany just floating around out there in their creepy coaches, and you don't want to come across any of them. So if you challenge the Ankou, if you challenge death, you will not get away with it. You're only going to be, and if you even seem to defeat him, you're only delaying the inevitable, which is death itself, and that comes for us all. But if you aid the Ankou, if you help him in any way whatsoever, he will let you live. He's not completely evil, he's fair. But the touch of death itself, to get so close to death, also means you must pay a price. And anyone who has come into contact with the Ankou, even briefly, has their hair turn white overnight. And in some stories, they become mute and no longer speak. And especially, they do not speak of their dealings with the dead. In Lewis Spence's 1917 Legends and Romances of Brittany, he says of the Ankou, "Perhaps there is no spirit of evil which is so much dreaded by the Breton peasantry as the Ankou, who travels the duchy in a cart picking up souls. In the dead of night, a creaking axle tree can be heard passing down the silent lanes. It halts at a door. The summons has been given. A soul quits the doomed house, and the wagon of the Ankou passes on. The Ankou herself, for the dread death spirit of Brittany is probably female, is usually represented as a skeleton." And then goes on to say, M. Anatole Lebras has elaborated a study of the whole question in his book on the legend of death in Brittany, and it is probable that the Ankou is a survival of the death goddess of the prehistoric dolmen builders of Brittany. Now, this is one of the few occasions I've come across the Ankou described as feminine, or like a woman, like a death goddess. So I thought I'd include it because it's really interesting to me. But usually in other sources that I've encountered, the Ankou is very much associated with being a masculine figure, being a man, a tall, old, gaunt, skeletal man with white flowing hair, never usually depicted as feminine or a woman at all. So pretty interesting that there are other people's different ideas and versions and theories of the Ankou, especially going on someone else's kind of their previous knowledge of other death goddesses and likening the Ankou to things that they already know like that. I mean, maybe it really is my love of goth music that I'm just likening the Ankou too much to the fields of Nephilim. But there we go. We all have our own preconceived ideas and notions that factor into the stories we tell and the way that we tell stories. I've said it before, but each storyteller will tell the same folktale in a completely different way because they will focus on the things that they find the most interesting. They will elaborate on things that they find the most interesting, and they will omit things that they don't find interesting, but other people will. So yeah, it's definitely useful to look at various different sources for the same creature or the same bit of folklore, because you'll find lots of interesting different tidbits that are not always very similar at all. So the telltale signs of the Ankou are, as I've said, the creepy funerary procession coming towards you on a corpse road in the dead of the night, but also there is that kind of the other senses. So there is the squeaking cart or wheelbarrow of the Ankou coming outside your house, your abode. And sometimes there's also the sound of birdsong, and most specifically the sounds of owls calling, the owl of the Ankou. The sounds of carts and wheelbarrows and owls are like pretty common sounds that you would hear in the countryside, in deep rural areas. Not, inherently creepy, but when associated with death and death portents and folklore, very much creepy indeed. So it's giving these common sounds, these things that you will come across quite often in rural areas, giving them this extra element of story associated with them and elevating them to something very frightening and creepy and easy to believe, really. Of course you're going to believe in the Ankou when a lot of there's nuggets of truth in all of these stories, whether or not it's the sound of an owl or a fox screaming or the creak of a wheelbarrow. There's these tiny little nuggets of truth in all of these folk tales that would have people truly, genuinely believing in them. Now, there are lots of death portents and quite creepy, gloomy folk tales in Breton mythology, actually. There's a lot of associations of death and demons, and I suppose if you have a landscape that's full of woodland and dark fields and what have you, then you're going to have quite creepy folklore associated with it. So we've talked about the Yan Gantitan, the demon, and we've talked about other creepy things in Brittany. So I'm going to end the episode here, and hopefully I will talk to you about more creepy things in Brittany one day. Although I might, for my next Breton episode, I might pick something a bit more cheery, actually. I don't want you to always think it's doom and gloom, though often seems to be. But I'll pick something much more cheery. We'll pick a nice hero tale of Brittany next time, which will be good fun. Thank you ever so much for listening. Again, I apologise for my chaos and my unprofessionalism and all that stuff. But if you do enjoy this podcast, and I'm really thankful for those of you who do, if you do enjoy it, you can also find me, like I said, on TikTok with the Wheel Martin Museum. You can see me on there, and I'm also under Celtic_Shan on there. Although I used to post a lot of folklore content on my personal TikTok, and I don't really anymore because brain. You can also support me on Patreon if you want, Celtic Myths and Legends. It really is so appreciated. The money from Patreon just goes back into hosting this podcast and that kind of stuff. It's not like I'm making a big profit or anything on this podcast. I'm really not, especially with how infrequent I upload anything. Really, the money just goes straight back into hosting the podcast and other things, other subscriptions that I have associated with my podcast, that I hopefully will utilise again one day. I always say it, but like I said, I would love to dedicate more time to this podcast one day. But thank you to anyone who is along for the journey with me right now for these first few years. And it has been a few years now. In fact, we're coming on to 5 years, if you can believe that. 5 years. I think this is my 25th episode in 5 years, and I still haven't perfected it yet. But one day I will. And all of you people that stuck along for the journey will be very glad that you did. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your week, month, year, life. Wish me luck for my surgery. I'm going to look very creepy and spooky for a good few weeks afterwards, because apparently my eyes will be blood red. Because as I said, they are operating on them both at the same time. Just getting it over and done with. Wham bam. Thank you, ma'am. I think that has very different connotations. Yes, if you want to support me, you can support me on Patreon. But all of these episodes are, of course, free, and I really do not expect anyone to, give me money ever. So it's not an expectation from me. Thank you very much for listening, and yes, good night. See you, hear you, listen to you, speak to you. That's the best. Speak to you next time, my friends. Good night.